Hello. Today I'm in conversation with myself, which is quite ironic because I want to talk about great conversations. Why are great conversations important? I think it's because it is a medium that helps us to connect with each other, that helps us to develop new ideas, to be innovative, to pass on information, to learn about different perspectives. So I think as facilitators, in the widest sense of the word, it's super important to be a great conversion partner. Do you say that? To be someone to be in great conversation with. And I have received many, many compliments for being a great conversation partner. And to be very honest, if there was one thing that I could do and earn a living from it without doing anything else, it would be podcasting. It would be being in conversations with others. And this is actually not true because it really depends on the conversation partner and the conversation. And I think it is really an art and maybe a lost art. And that's what I want to reflect on today. So when we think of conversations, there are always two sides to it. It's like a partner dance, and not just any partner dance. It's more like swing dance, where both can be in the role of the lead and the follower. And this is true even for an interview, I think, where both need to inspire each other. And recently, in one of the Never Done Before workshops, Myriam, she did an experiment with us where, in groups of two, one had to share something they're really passionate about. Um, and the other person had to intentionally not pay attention, look away, and really give the other person the impression as if they were not interested. And the impact was quite astonishing. There was even one participant who started crying because they didn't feel heard and listened to, because it's such a strong feeling of rejection. And I think even at a smaller scope, we realize if someone is really listening to us. So I think to be a great conversation partner, you need one person who is sharing and speaking to the other person instead of at the other person. I think that's very important. And it takes the other person to really listen with a full body and absorb. And I think this is why I get the compliment a lot of being a great conversation partner, a great podcast host, because I'm really curious. And I only invite guests that I'm really 100% curious about. In 99% of the cases, I do have an exploration call to mostly test the chemistry. Is this person someone I can imagine to have a 1.5 hour long conversation with? And believe it or not, it's usually in the first 30 seconds that I know whether it's a yes or no, whether I invite them on the show or not. And in these 30 seconds, it's about the curiosity that I feel towards them and their openness. And then we have a little bit of a conversation, and I usually stop the exploration call, either because I'm so curious and I want to ask so many questions, and then I stop because I want to keep the curiosity for the podcast. And that's very important. The second reason could be that I just don't feel it. And then I try to make it as short and painless as possible to just inform the other person that it's nothing personal, but I don't feel the fit for the podcast. So why do I stop the exploration call if I'm getting curious? Because I realized that if I asked the question already in the exploration call, I would not ask the same question on the podcast, because if I know the answer, why would I ask? And this actually led me to come up with 3 rules of how I ask questions. Rule number 1, I only ask questions if I'm really curious and if I want to know the answer, which means if I do know the answer already, then I don't ask the question because I won't listen to the same degree. Number two is I don't ask a question if very often there is an answer. So if there is one answer to a question, I ask ChatGPT, to be very honest, or I Google it. If I ask a question, then I'm more interested in the perspective or the experience of the other person. And this makes it interesting. If I am in conversation with someone, I am curious and I want to know what the world looks like through their eyes. And they will sense that and they will see it in my body. I will lean in, or maybe tilt my head a little bit, and I will sit there in silence. And the last rule for me not to ask a question is if I don't want to hear an answer. And that's actually something that I learned from my mom when I was very small. She once told me, Myriam, one life advice: never ask a question if there is an answer that you don't want to hear. So I learned very early never to ask the question, honey, do you love me? Because if the question is no, then how would I react? Am I really willing to hear the no? Um, yeah. So these are my 3 rules for question asking. And I think that asking questions is an important ingredient for having great conversations. And it's also one of the facilitation skills. So I think to be a great conversation partner means also to be a great facilitator because we're making the conversation easy. And there are a few elements I think that will resonate with facilitators. One is presence, to be fully there. If my mind is somewhere else, if I'm on my phone, if I'm thinking of my shopping list, I might miss the one clue, the one thing that is actually the little string that comes out of their t-shirt and that I want to pull so that we have, so that we can go to the essence. And hence I need to be present, which means that often I have this look in my face that doesn't look pretty at all. It reminds me of student times, and this might sound familiar to you. I remember when I sat in the library with my book, and then someone would pass, and I want to look pretty. Flirting student in the library. And then I put on a smile and tried to look cute. And suddenly I could not focus on the text that I was reading anymore. Because trying to look good and being focused on a task don't go well together. So if you watch the recordings of these podcast episodes, very often you will see me kind of looking very weird with the mouth a little bit open and staring at the other person because I'm very present and absorbed by what they are saying. And they will sense that. So presence is one of the facilitation skills we need to be a great conversation partner. Sitting in silence, especially when we're asking a question, because if we're asking a question that we're really curious about and that resonates with the other person, of course, they need a little moment to think about it. The beauty with the podcast and is that we're not live streaming. So I have Gordon in the back end who then cuts out all the silent breaks. Very often you will hear the silent breaks if you watch the video on YouTube, because these are usually not edited. But sitting in silence and letting the other person think is important. And if we cannot do that, then we jump in, and then we ask maybe another question, or we start answering our own questions, and then we start assuming, and we kill the conversation. The silence is also important for us to actually think of the next question and absorb what the person has said, because what is the default mode of many in conversation is that we hear something and then we already think of a response or reply or something to add. Oh, yeah, I can totally relate to what you said. The same has happened to me. And hop, the conversation is on our side and it's all about us. One of my podcast guests once said that the most important question is the follow-up question. And I think it's so beautiful and so true, because when we listen to someone, we are present to what they are saying, then we pause to absorb, and then we ask a follow-up question that goes deeper. Then we're getting to the real stuff. And this will make them feel heard and seen, feel comfortable, and thereby also being at their best. Because to be honest, if we realize that someone is really curious about us, this helps us shine. And as in the example I gave earlier of Myriam's workshop at the NDB, if we have the impression that someone is not interested in what we are saying, our story, everything falls flat. We just feel insecure, not interesting, and then we start blubbering, we fizzle out, maybe we stop mid-sentence because we don't feel inspired to share our story. So we do need the audience, we do need the silence, and we do need the presence. Already spoke about the art of asking questions, which is also a facilitation skill. And courage. I think facilitators and great conversation partners are courageous because they dare to be vulnerable without oversharing. We don't want to make the other person feel comfortable because we're sharing personal details that don't belong there. But I think the degree of vulnerability that shows that we are human and that help the other person to relate, because it's in these small vulnerabilities, sharing something personal about us, something we like, maybe a mistake, a fear. The other person can relate to it and has a hook that will connect us. And then again, we can go deeper, because we do need a level of trust to have a great conversation. There's subjective and objective sides to what is a great conversation. Subjective, it's us feeling seen and heard and having all these ideas and yes-anding each other. And my girlfriend once said that great conversations is like having sex with your clothes on. And yes, I totally agree. It's this excitement. And I will come back to the topic of why very often we stop having great conversations with our loved ones. I come to that. I will park it here and I won't forget. So the objective measures of great conversations, and that's actually interesting and relevant also for facilitators and especially for managers. There are studies that show, and I guess we can all relate to the situation, that we have a tendency to evaluate conversations as better the more time we spoke. So the more speaking time we have in a conversation, the better we would evaluate these ex post afterwards. And we all have been in the situations that we were in, air quotes, conversation with someone, not speaking a word. And after an hour or half an hour, they would say, oh, you're such a great conversation partner. And you're like, didn't say a word. So this is actually relevant for managers, because when we think of meetings, where very often it's the most important, highest paid person in the room that is hosting the meeting, they would be also very often the person who speaks the most. And then afterwards, they have the impression that it was an amazing meeting, while everyone else was actually feeling annoyed or drained or depleted. So this is something to be extremely aware of, especially when we increase in status, that we have a tendency to speak more and then have a biased view on the quality of the conversation. So it's even then more important to ask questions to the other person and really include them, ask them for their perspective and make it a dance or a ping pong. The other objective measure, apparently, is a very small word. Research has shown that people tend to evaluate conversations as better the more the word and was used by their conversation partner, which is an ode to improvisation theater. It always says, okay, we have to yes and each other, accept all offers, build on the ideas. And I think that's exactly what it is. When you listen to my podcast, what I often do is I respond with the word and to my conversation partner. Yes, and this makes me think of, and what comes up for me. And so we're the small word and does not necessarily mean that we agree. It means that we acknowledge that something has been said and we are building on that. I was once at a PhD summer school, and there was this Harvard professor, Leibson. I think his name was Leibson. And he asked a question, and I was, as almost always, a little bit too fast. So I gave a response which was clearly wrong. And he looked at me and said, "Yes, Myriam. And have you thought of?" And said the exact opposite. And this really changed the way how I respond to answers, how I ask questions, and how I see the word and. Doesn't need to mean I agree, but it opens the door and creates psychological safety for everyone in the space because you're building on what they said and you're not dismissing them. And I could go on a tangent here that I won't, because there are many cultures, many people who actually start sentences with no. No, 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 we should definitely do that. No, I perfectly agree. And I'm actually coming from a family where we do this a lot. And it's interesting to see the effect of these small words on a conversation and the dance that it becomes. For me, subjectively, a great conversation feels as if I had the opportunity to think a new thought for the first time and speak it out, and had the impression that this thought then does something to the other person and they reflect it back. So if I can witness the other person combining old ideas in a new way, if I can observe them how they are taking a nugget from me to include it in their own process and bring it back to me, this is so powerful, makes me so happy that I can go from no energy to full energy even after a 3-hour long conversation. And that's what makes a great conversation. And to be able to facilitate that, we have to pay attention to that and we have to be open to that. So judgment or assumptions are killers to great conversations. If we feel that the other person is consciously or unconsciously, verbally or non-verbally judging us, and judging does not mean disagreeing. Judging means, oh, you're that kind of person. Oh, do you really believe that? Whereas disagreeing is like, oh, I hear you and I totally have a different opinion. Let's discuss. And then it becomes interesting. But judgment is something that makes us feel small, not worthy. And the moment we sense that, conversation is dead because we need to be at eye level. We need to respect each other to be in a great conversation. We need to be curious about each other. And curiosity and judgment cannot be present at the same time. And there's another thing that kills a great conversation. And this is something that has happened a few times during podcast recordings, that I would have the impression that my guest starts to talk at me or to lecture me. Let me explain. Which made me realize that another ingredient for a great conversation is that we don't assume to know how much the other person knows. Because there is a difference in sharing knowledge with someone who doesn't know and lecturing the other person. And there's a term, mansplaining. Apparently, men are better in lecturing others than women. It's this assuming that the other person doesn't have the same knowledge and explaining them without making space or even double checking if the other person really doesn't know, or making space for the other person to contribute. So for me, the beauty lies in the flow where someone shares their experience, and then I am curious to ask more and more questions and thereby get the explanation or learn from them without them giving me a full speech and lecture. And I've actually stopped podcast interviews in the middle of the thing, saying that I'm sorry, this doesn't work for me because I feel as if I'm talked at and I have nothing to contribute and I haven't said anything for the last 15 minutes and this doesn't work. And it is painful for both sides. And at the end, I think the audience, you definitely realize and hear it if both parties are engaged in the conversation and whether I listen with curiosity or not. So a great conversation partner creates gaps and pauses for the other person to ask follow-up questions. And I think that's the difference then also between a lecture and a conversation. Where in a lecture, you get questions at the end, if any. In a conversation, you share a piece and then either the other person adds to it, maybe a question, maybe a different perspective, maybe something on top to complement the information, but it is a ping pong between the two. And if you don't make space for the other person to contribute or at least say a little bit of, tell me more, then very likely you will lose their attention after a bit. And I think it is a high art of speaking, really giving a speech in a way that keeps the audience attracted. And actually, this right now is one of those experiments. I don't know whether you are still listening or not. But I think if you would sit in front of me and me giving you all this speech, you would definitely turn away and leave because there's no, it doesn't make any sense. You would rather listen to a podcast. And here we go. Anyway, a great conversation puts both partners in a flow state of speaking and listening and throwing the ball of curiosity to each other. And I think this almost leads us to the end. Oh, and I have this little package here that I parked. A reflection of why very often we stop having great conversations with our loved ones. And I think there are a few things to that. One is very often just the lack of time. And especially if we are running errands, maybe a family and kids, then really to sit down to be present with each other is already a challenge. But then the better we know someone, the more we somehow assume that we already know their perspective. We know what they like for breakfast and what their morning routine is, and so on and so forth. And as I said earlier, for me, a great conversation is about the curiosity of what the other person says, to really listen, not to reply, but to listen, to be surprised, to listen with this openness, not knowing what will come next. And we see, air quotes, old couples who finish each other's sentences. And if you finish someone's sentence, you assume that you know what they're going to say. So how can you be surprised? And I think if we learn to pause and to listen, be present with each other, there is a higher chance of having great conversations with our partners. And the other one is, and I don't know whether this is actually opposing, but an observation that I have about myself also on the podcast very often, that there is an element also to impress the other person. So great conversation. We are on our toes. We are present. We are fast. We listen. We want to build on each other, but maybe we also want to impress the other person in one way or another. And I think with our loved ones, maybe we take them for granted and we lost this want to impress them. And I realized that in many conversations that I have, great conversations that I have with people that I actually do want to impress, I have a tendency also to interrupt them, which is actually quite counterintuitive, because one might think that, interruption means not respecting or not being interested in what they are saying. But very often I just get so excited and I want to be very quick, and then I'm sometimes too quick because I want to impress them. So this is also something to pay attention, how your reaction and the way you're listening and responding might be interpreted differently from what you intend. So yeah, this is all I have to say and all I know about having great conversations. So in summary, for me, great conversations are the outcomes of hard and soft skills. And again, they can be summarized as facilitation or leadership skills, the art of asking questions, the ability to be present and hold silence, to be curious, to be courageous, to respect each other, to share knowledge without assuming that the other person doesn't know, or without being interested in their perspective, even if they don't have the same amount of knowledge. And I think if we practice and learn the art of speaking and listening, of dancing, in using our verbal skills, we can nurture better connections, improve learning, growth, innovation, and have better relationships at work and in our private lives. So I hope that you maybe got one or two new ideas about having great conversations. And that was it. Thank you for listening. And thank you for following the podcast. Bye for now.